I'm Holly Cunningham, and I am the Executive Director of the Near North Mobile Media Lab in North Bay, Ontario. And I found myself part of this conversation in digital infrastructure for rural and northern communities. I think through this sort of evolution of my work at the Media Lab and sort of how we have tried specifically the mobile unit model, but also the ways in which that hasn't worked and the ways in which everything feels very connected. And the other models that we were talking about in these sessions actually are very important as well. So what was really interesting about this, this project or being part of this discussion was that it was actually very hard for me to stay within the mobile unit as a concept. But I actually think that the conversation that's come out of that is very fruitful and important. So I'm just going to start with that sort of like the history and the narrative of my work. So I started working at the Near North Mobile Media Lab in 2009. At that time, the organization was a collective of artists who were working in media arts, and they had this little trailer that they called the Shrimp, and they towed it behind a truck, and they would take it to communities in the area to do projects in the media arts. So they kind of use it as a production vehicle. Sometimes they do workshops, and that's where the mobile came in the name of the organization. Around that time, when I started working there, there was this program that I wasn't really part of, but I was just coming into the organization as they were having their exhibition, and it was called Real Northern. And it was an exhibition of Northern Ontario media artists, video artists, sound artists, and filmmakers. And it was at the Public Art Gallery in North Bay. And I just thought it was so cool to see all of these sort of established and mid-career artists doing all this really amazing work from the region, because I'd never heard of anyone like working in this area like that. And if fast forward to 2012, I was now the executive director. We decided to revisit this program and do a second installation called Real Northern 2. And so at this point, I was much more involved in recruiting and connecting and finding artists to be part of this exhibition. And I found it very, very hard to locate and find mid-career to established artists in Northern Ontario. I knew a few in our region, in the North Bay area, but to try to find artists working in other places, it just was very difficult. So this was intriguing to me. I come from Southern Ontario originally. I'm actually from Hamilton. And I've lived in Toronto, and I just found it so interesting that there seemed to be this gap in artists at that stage of their career. So I did a bit of desk research after the exhibition. We did end up locating artists. It took a while, but we did find enough. We had a show, it was great. But I was very intrigued by that question after I left that project. And just with some simple desk research on trends in the region, it was very clear that out-migration specifically was a huge problem and something that a lot of communities in the North were experiencing. And that term was really tied to folks who either are about to start college or who have just finished college in the North, moving to a major city. Specifically Toronto, probably the GTA area mostly. They were moving either for school or they were going for jobs. And it was usually a lot of folks that were creative, a lot of artists, and people who were not finding that community or those opportunities in the North for them. And even more of this research kind of pointed, like research that had already been done about this in the region was really pointing to this idea that if and when they do return, they're in their 30s and they're starting families and settling down. So they tend to be less risk takers, and they tend to not be, having the constraints of the realities of raising a family and having dependents. We were just kind of missing out on this whole demographic of like young people in our area, and this was happening all around the North. So it was interesting to me to see that this demographic, that was something that was identified in the whole, was really playing out in our field. And so we ended up taking this question. I was very curious, obviously. So we took this question on the road, and we actually, we got a grant to do an environmental scan of the region and start to ask specifically this question of other mid-sized communities in the North. The questions we were asking were like, do you have artists here? How are the youth doing? Are they staying? Do they not stay? And then what do you need, or what do you think you need? And kind of just really asking those questions. This was around 2013, 2014. And at the time, when we were thinking about these consultations, I think when you go to propose these questions and you go consult with community, you're really thinking about your solution already. And you're like, oh, we're just going to take our mobile lab and we're going to bring them everything they need. And I think what we learned was that we actually didn't have the answers, which was really great that we did the consultation and that we talked to community and asked them what they wanted, because we didn't really know. And in our conversations with these folks, they were saying, yes, we have this gap. Yes, the youth are leaving. No, we don't want you to come in and do programming and leave. We have lots of that going on. And at one point, someone referred to it as parachute programming. So coming in, parachuting in, and then running away, and leaving the community without any substantial resources so that they can continue to do the work that you are trying to introduce them to. And also this idea that you know better than them. I mean, that's just something that we struggle with, like, I think on a whole, like lots of organizations and folks from bigger cities coming into the north. So when we started asking them, so what do you want? Their answers were access to equipment that stays in the community and that is accessible to everyone. They wanted expertise, mentors, opportunities to learn and have hands-on experience using the equipment. They wanted access to community, a gathering space, somewhere that was permanent that they could go to and connect with others. So we quickly ditched the whole mobile idea, not as a whole, but within the context of trying to bring resources to community. And we started thinking about other methods that we could be delivering that part of what we do as an organization. So it is hard sometimes to admit failure. And I believe that in my experience, we have had lots of times where we felt like we failed. But I think over the years, I've kind of turned that into seeing it as a learning experience, and that it's very important from getting to A to B, and actually growing something that's important and meaningful for the communities that you're trying to serve. For our own learnings of spearheading a mobile unit for Northern Ontario, as I mentioned before, the mobile model was not as successful as being the means in which to deliver resources and learning and education to communities. However, we knew that it could still be meaningful, and people tended to get excited and they really liked the idea of mobile, and it was still in our name. So unless we were going to do a total rebrand, we were like, okay, let's figure this out. We had a lot of folks ask us about our little tiny trailer and whether they could use it for a production, or like an artist asking to take it on the road. And we decided that we would test out doing a residency program that's mobile. So in 2017, we ended up purchasing this 30-foot RV, a little big, a little unwieldy, but it was awesome. We renovated the back into like a studio space, and then the front was sort of like the living space. And through 2018, 2019, we started to pilot this residency program, where artists would actually get to drive the RV to whatever location they were interested in Northern Ontario, park it wherever they wanted to go, tour through, different like provincial parks, or just go to random sites and work on media arts projects with like all the tools that they needed, computers, plug in, we've got energy, we've got Wi-Fi. We had like a Wi-Fi satellite stick, so everything they needed. And I think we were learning a lot about what was really exciting and cool about the program and what maybe we needed to change about the program. I think specifically the vehicle itself was too large. We actually were really excited about the size of it because we thought two artists could work together and have private sleeping spaces, but it ended up just being so big that artists were intimidated to drive it. And then enter COVID, which definitely, I think the whole question of failure and pivoting or changing what you do has been something that everybody has had to learn how to deal with and cope with at this time. And specifically for our residency program, COVID just kind of pushed the risk of, like with the insurance companies, a little over the edge for us, and it just got too expensive to insure. So our insurance was already pretty high, but just in the context of insurance companies being extra adverse to risk, it became too expensive, like not manageable for us. So we are actually parting with the vehicle, and we are shifting and looking at another way to reimagine the residency. And the mobile option is definitely not off the table. I think we would just look at doing it in a different way, but we're also looking at possibly doing residencies that are more stationary, or a residency that can travel in partnership with other spaces and other locations that we can maybe put artists in. So it's kind of exciting in my opinion, because we're reimagining it. We're looking towards the future. And I think it's okay to say that, like, that particular project, if COVID hadn't happened, it may have been successful, but we'll never really know. But just to say that I think that the mobile unit model is really exciting, and it's really exciting to a lot of people. And I think that for artists to be able to travel and be nimble and be mobile and go to places is really exciting for them. And you'll see it in like van life, like people just love to be on the road. They like to take, they like to have everything with them. They can just take it on the road, and they can have like everything they need in one place, and they don't have to be tied to any particular space. So I actually think it's not a dead idea, and I think it's still happening, and it's still going to go forward, and it'll probably just evolve into a new, more sort of meaningful mobile residency for artists in the future. So something that I had talked about a lot in our first initial conversations was this idea of entry points. And I think when I go back to thinking about that question of artists staying and growing artists in the North, and making sure that we have mid-career established artists living and working here, I kept coming back to this idea of like the entry point. So when and how does a person connect with the art that they're going to now then in the future become an artist or a practitioner of? And as someone who grew up in Hamilton, I have a fond memory of going to an animation camp when I was like 11. And I just it was the coolest thing I'd ever done. I was hooked from that moment on. I took all the media arts courses in high school. Like I just, that just set me on this trajectory to like wanting to do media art and be involved in any kind of like video or filmmaking or anything like that. And I think that if I hadn't had that experience, possibly I would have another entry point, or I would have connected with it again at some point in time. But when I'm thinking about all of the youth in Northern Ontario that may not have the same opportunities, who are going to high schools that don't even have a media arts option, I think about the fact that they may never connect to that entry point. And if they don't have that place in which they can begin the practice of their art, then you're missing out on an entire cohort of potential artists who will never actually connect until they move and leave and go to a big city and have the opportunity. And we've had this discussion a lot at the Media Lab, because we did end up starting a program called Digital Creator North, based on all the research we had done in the communities that I'd spoken of earlier, where we basically started these youth-centered spaces in partnership with libraries, museums, and community centers, where there's a full-time mentor, there's access to equipment, and it's basically just like a space dedicated to teenagers and young adults. I think we were going from like 14 to 21 was kind of like our range. And it was kind of difficult to get funding for that, because when we look at the funders for the arts in Canada, a lot of the funders are really focused on professional artists. And so they should be. It's obviously very beneficial for us to have funding for professional artists, but it's if our education system is not catching up in certain places in the country or certain places in the province, then, you know, you're really missing out on a crucial piece that is actually very connected to the development and eventual, you know, work of professional artists. And yeah, making that leap can be kind of difficult in an application, but we made it work, and we got funding for it. And we have real world examples of our programming actually impacting the trajectory of an artist, which is really exciting. So we started in 2017, and we've seen some of the teenagers that came to like our earliest programming going to college, going to film school, practicing, like becoming artists, like, you know, being in festivals, and it's been really exciting to watch that. But yeah, I think the entry point question is really, to me, that was a really important. So I'm just going to take a little detour and talk about something that I think is also important, and it really relates to the funding question about, you know, really trying to get to the same goal that the funders want you to get to, but taking maybe a route that they're not comfortable with. And we had this discussion when we were all talking together the other day. Basically, like a lot of the data that we were getting from the surveys that we conducted with the youth that were coming to Digital Creator in early 2020 before COVID shut us down, was really mind-blowing and really exciting. A lot of the questions we were asking were very specific for our funders. Questions like, what are you learning? What skills are you developing? And I think the funders were hoping to be like, I'm becoming a filmmaker. I'm learning how to use a camera. I'm learning how to do lighting. And that very, like, you know, specific, like, we can tangibly see that this is happening. But all of their answers were about like emotional development. So they were reading the questions differently, and their experiences of Digital Creator North was like completely not about that at all. And they were saying things like, I learned how to make friends. I learned how not to be lonely. And it was like really amazing. And the skills they were developing were like, I'm developing skills of like, you know, learning how to listen to people. And we were just like, oh my God, this is like not what we expected. So we didn't know how to deal with that in terms of like our funders, because they're asking these other things of us. But it made me realize that what makes a successful community, whether you're doing an art, like whether you're trying to develop an artistic community, or you're trying to create this space for youth to come in and learn about digital media, the emotional takeaway is so important for those people. You're not going to have a successful space. You're not going to create a community that will be impactful and will support their careers and will support them to continue if they're not getting those pieces from it. And it's difficult because in Canada, I think it's a double-edged sword in that we are so lucky to have public funding for the arts. And the funding comes from the levels of government, and it's wonderful. The US doesn't have that, right? And I'm saying the US because a lot of our models we were looking at for Digital Creator North were based in the US, that we were kind of pulling from as like frameworks to work within. And but the thing is, they're way less constricted because their funding is from like foundations and private donors. So they can mix the whole like emotional stuff and like, you know, social support for youth with the arts. And it doesn't have to be just media arts. They can do sewing, and they can do like painting and whatever, and science projects. And like, really, it's not like tied to this box of a discipline or some kind of medium that they have to be working in. And I found with Digital Creator, that's where we really got a little bit held back, I guess, from where we wanted to go with things, because we are kind of asked to be very specifically like, how are they developing hard skills? How are, you know, what specific discipline are you working within? You know, media arts has to be digital. Like if youth want to play ukulele and sew, we have to have another youth videotape them to make sure that we're still fitting within like what our funders are funding us for and what our organization is all about. So anyway, just to say that I think those entry points I think like everything is connected, and it's a lot bigger and a lot more complicated than we think. Like we think we're just going to put tools in a space and we're going to have really great mentors, everything's going to be cool. But there's just so many more deeper emotional layers to that need to be thought of. And the most successful spaces we ran were spaces where the mentor connected so well with the youth. A good example of sort of the cultivation of like an emotionally safe space, or a space that kind of delivers like something to folks deeper than just like the tools and the learning, would probably be our new Lisker location early on in the Digital Creator North program. We had specifically a mentor in there that was just really good at connecting to teens and really made it into a space where the teens felt really safe. And specifically in that community, a lot of LGBTQ teens did like not have anywhere to go. That was like a queer safe space. So the space became that for a lot of youth in the community. And those youth were also interested in making movies and recording music and making video games and playing video games. And so the two really lended, like the two worked so well together. And I think that we need to be more open to those bigger questions of what does art actually give to your community, and how do people, what that entry point really means for them. So sometimes I think for these teenagers, the entry point is a space of connection and a space where they're allowed to be themselves and they're being supported and it's safe, and then they can become artists, or that inspires them to start to pursue the artwork. Anyway, just that like sometimes we're a little too boxed in Canada, I think, like with our funding. So happy to have it, but I think we need to be a little more open to like what the possibilities are there. So I'm going to take a pretty obvious one. I think I had spoken about like, using some models from the US in Canada. And specifically after we had done that tour where we were consulting with communities and understanding what they need, I had gone to a conference. I got a grant from the Canada Council to travel to Los Angeles, which was pretty cool to be able to go there just as a vacation, but to go to a conference called Digital Media and Learning. And it was really about cutting edge organizations around the globe that were doing specifically like youth focused programs where they were teaching youth how to be more engaged in like media. So like online, and making sure that more like internet like justice or whatever, like people making sure folks were part of the conversation, because media is so, social media and content creators are so important now. Like how do we make sure that the playing field is equal, and how can we build equity into like the work that we do? So there were some amazing people at this conference. I was completely blown away. One of the organizations I was most drawn to was called Media, and it's a youth, basically like an unstructured / structured youth space in Chicago within their public library system, and they have over 30 spaces. But their main sort of flagship space is at the Harold Washington Public Library, which is the biggest library in Chicago, right in the downtown core. I connected with them and said, listen, I'm super inspired by the program that you're running. I actually think that this could really work in Northern Canada, like or Northern Ontario. And they were super excited to share a lot of knowledge with us, and actually invited us to Chicago in 2017. And we got to connect and go see all the spaces and meet their mentors and really like see it in action. And it was just incredible to see how these spaces had really, I feel like what was so obvious to me was that they had listened to the youth about what they wanted and needed, and the space had become really the youth space. It wasn't like a bunch of adults trying to make a cool space for teenagers. It was clearly like the teens had taken over. And there were so many little tidbits and learning pieces that we found, that we cultivated from that trip, of ways in making your space encourage more ownership of the artists and of the youth. They had like they had youth that were pure teachers, like pure mentors and training each other. There were youth that were just hanging out, eating pizza and playing video games, and they weren't doing anything at all to do with learning or making art. And that was okay. if you wanted to show up and hang out with your friends and play video games or do your homework, like that was also okay. And these are things that were big learning pieces for us, because when we were making Digital Creator, I think there's this like real desire to be like, this has to be a space of learning and creation. And, you know, if a teenager just wants to come here and hang out and not do anything, like they're not allowed to stay. But we totally like shifted and we were like, yeah, this will be a space where you can just do anything in it. Like it's just a safe space for you to come and hang out. If you want to learn a new tool, if you want to work on a project, if you want to collaborate on something, then all the tools are here. And there's a mentor who's also an artist. We made sure that all the mentors were actual practicing artists who would also be working on their own work in the space. And eventually a lot of these teenagers will actually gravitate towards doing something. They may just hang out and play video games for the first like couple weeks or first month or two, but eventually they'll be like, what about making a video game? And then they'll just kind of like gravitate towards like what other people are doing. So anyway, just that it was an incredibly eye-opening trip. And it also just opened my mind to the idea that we don't have to stay in Canada or where we know, you know, what we're comfortable with and people that we know and places that we know. Like we can just kind of like try to put ourselves a little bit further out there, go to Los Angeles, meet a bunch of people you've never met before, see what they're doing in Chicago. And sometimes they have these amazing ideas that can be transferred to our communities. It's not going to be completely the same. Inner city Chicago youth are completely different from rural and northern, you know, Ontario youth, but there's a lot of pieces that I could see similarities in, that a lot of the youth were feeling isolated or they felt like they didn't have a space that was their own. Looking outside of Canada and just like having that experience and being really open to that was like really helpful in developing the program because it connected us with UMedia. And just a cool little piece there. One of their alum is Chance the Rapper. I think he's the most famous of their of the UMedia alums. So they've had like a lot of big successes. And he comes back and plays a show for all the youth every year, and no adults are allowed in the show. Yeah. I think the big takeaway from our experiences here, or my own individual experience being part of the Media Lab and the work that we do, has been let the youth lead, make youth-led spaces, give them opportunities to be creative and flourish. And when I say youth, I mean anywhere from like preteen up until young adult, like that whole time when people are learning about themselves and they're cultivating an identity. That's such an important community that gets very neglected in our region, I think. If you give them spaces to be creative and flourish and grow their own sense of community and self, that's going to be so impactful on the identity and the sense of artistic community that you will have in your own cities and towns. If communities are losing all of their youth to out-migration, then they're just losing all their future generations of artists. So that cycle will just continue. And I think the other piece too is a little bit beyond the control of maybe just the arts community, but I think cities and city planning perspectives need to consider all of this being connected. So when you have artists that are going to make your city better and it's going to make it like more vibrant and your economy is going to do better, but those artists want to have an exciting place to live in. So you have to have music, live music at night, and festivals and good food and like fun places for them to be at and inspiring locations. So I think another piece that we've been working on at the Media Lab, or at least personally myself, has just been a lot of like talking to city council and trying to be on as many roundtables and discussions about the future of our city in North Bay specifically, and trying to really make sure that they understand that the arts is like such an important piece of like city planning and growing the city. And I think we've been able to really convince them finally. And we have an organization called Creative Industries now, and they're kind of like the arts council or the arts advocate group in town. And they've helped to raise the profile of the arts and the creative sector in North Bay. And it's just done the city such a world of good. But yeah, just to bring it back to, I think everything is connected. It's larger than we think it is. But if we start with the youth, and give them the spaces to grow and flourish, then I think that's the starting point of making sure that you, or of creating a vibrant artistic community wherever you are. Canada Council and OAC, like, start funding youth organizations, because I know, or maybe we need just more funding. Like, maybe we need an arts council or a branch that just does like youth funding, because yeah, it just feels like such an important piece. And I think we're leaving it up to the education system, which we know isn't the best. So we're leaving it up to like schools and universities to shape the youth artists of the future. But I think that the arts community should be doing a lot of that work too. We just don't have access to the funding that we need for it, because the councils don't really love funding youth programs, and it's difficult to break into other forms of funding. I think Trillium is a great funder, but they only go so far. But anyway, just that there's a bit of a funding disconnect there. And so it gets really difficult to continue this type of work that we do. So yeah, the last point I was just thinking about was the idea that like we just kind of talked about, the only youth who, like, if you're living in sort of a rural or northern area where there's not a lot of resources, the youth that are going to flourish are usually coming from like more privileged families. They can afford to either send them to a city to learn about something, or buy them expensive equipment online. And I've seen that here too, where it's like there's some teens who like are sent to New York City to do like film school when they're like 13 or 14, and their parents bought them really expensive cameras, and like they're doing amazing stuff. But not every youth has that opportunity. So if we want an equitable conversation, like we want to have like artistic dialogue coming from the whole country, all rural northern spaces, then we need to understand those entry points, and we need to make it more equitable for youth to experience and connect with art no matter where they are. And then I think we're going to see that future, because it's going to take a generation. You'll see all of these artists, I think, coming from these places that you've never seen an artist come from before.